Good morning, good morning. All right. So we are Elk Mountain Mission, Chapter 20, The Long Way Home. So last time we talked about them fleeing last time, and of course trampled under the bus Alfred Billings, the leader, with how disorganized his retreat was, with how he left a man on the mountain, with basically everything that he did wrong, because we get to do that from our nice, plush, cushy chairs from the future. So, although admittedly, even though we can comfortably say that, yeah, he was a bad leader and made bad choices, I think the reason why is just because he was a regular guy. And that was not what was needed. So, and I think there's a few things that, I don't know about the health of him and his companions that left their other man on the mountain, but hopefully we'll get to that. So, most of them went quickly home to Manti. There was a section that took the long way home because they were driving the cattle. And so this is probably the section on that. All right, the men chosen by Alfred Billings to go by the Spanish Fork route, so that's the ones going, up and over the Uintas Mountains, that if you follow from Salt Lake down to Moab now, that's the path they're going. So, the men chosen by Alfred Billings to go by the Spanish Fork route evidently accepted their assignment without question, even though none of them had been over the trail before. Only a month previous, 15 men and 35 horses from the mission had been on that trail, headed home. 35 horses walking a straight line, single file, always left a good trail to follow. The men didn't expect any trouble following the trail. Luckily, one of the mission's record keepers was a member of this three-man group, but William Wilson Sterrett was not a prolific writer. In fact, in his journal is the most Spartan of them all. His scant rendering is depressingly short on details. His story of a remarkable life and death frontier experience covering most of a month is condensed to a single post-dated journal entry covering less than a page of script. Fortunately, Sterrett did give a few more details in a letter he wrote to Deseret News shortly after he returned to Salt Lake City. His story, as it is related here, is a summary of his single journal entry and his letter to the Deseret News. Sterrett began his account. After crossing the Green River, Brother Billings selected three of us, C.A. Huntington, Richard W. James, and myself, to travel up the river to strike the Spanish Fork Trail to intercept any of our brethren that might be coming back. We took 3 days' provisions and started the Billings Company keeping the trail. We went out. Sorry, this is a bit disjointed. Let me try that again. We took 3 days' provision and started the Billings Company keeping the trail. We went out the Elk Mountain cutoff to Huntington Creek. So, when Sterrett said they intended to travel up the river to strike the Spanish Fork Trail, he meant that they would follow the Price River to Upper Castle Valley. There they would cross the mountain into Spanish Fork Canyon and follow it down into Utah Valley and the towns of Spanish Fork and Provo. Like the previous party that took the Spanish Fork Trail in August, the three men believed the Price River to be the Duchesne River. This mistake didn't make a difference to those previous travelers who made it safely over the mountain in a timely fashion. But for this band of brothers, the mistake caused real confusion. Okay, so the two parties separated on September 26th near the banks of the Green River. John McEwen wrote, "Rose at daybreak, started sun 1 hour high. The bottom of the banks of the river to the bench had been entirely overflowed. Very muddy. Good traveling once we got to the bench above the floodplain of the river. Very soon the three of the men left us, taking the Spanish Fork Trail." Sterrett tells, We turned northeast, he meant northwest, over a barren plain for 30 miles to Duchesne's Fork, Price River, where we camped with poor feed for our animals. Obviously, they didn't take Gunnison's Cottonwood Wash Trail, but turned north just a few miles from the Green River to follow the trail left by the homebound missionaries in August. Again, this trail follows the modern route of Highway 6 and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. After reaching the Price River, Sterrett says everything went well for 2 days. 2 days up the river would have taken them to the north end of Castle Valley near Wellington and Price. He said they couldn't always follow Gunnison's old wagon road because even the wagon tracks had been washed out by heavy rains the week before. Of course, all signs of horse tracks had been washed away too. Near Wellington, the Gunnison Road looped southwest, following the natural curve of Castle Valley. The Spanish Fork Trail continued up the Price River to Willow Creek, then up Willow Creek to Emma Park along the modern route of Highway 191. But somewhere between Wellington and Willow Creek, the three men missed the trail and became hopelessly lost. They had been told to follow the river where the river forked. At the fork, they were to follow the right-hand fork into the mountains to the north. They were told that a good trail followed the right-hand fork that would take them to Spanish Fork Canyon and the settlements of the Uinta Valley. But with all of the tributary creeks running high from recent rains, which one was the right-hand fork of the river? None of the men had been there before, and with all of the trails washed out, it was anyone's guess. Of the dilemma, William Sterrett had only this to say: the trail we were searching for, I presume, had been obliterated, for we never found it. They might have followed Willow Creek to Emma Park and missed the turn to White River Creek and Soldier Summit. If so, they probably continued north along the route of today's Highway 191 to Reservation Ridge, the high mountain divide between Castle Valley and Uinta Basin. Here they would have been at the top of the Strawberry River watershed where all streams flow northward into the Uinta Basin. More likely, however, they had mistaken the flooded Soldier Creek, just east of Wellington, for the right-hand fork of the Duchesne River, and followed it to Whitmore Park, Minnie Maud, and Argyle Ridge country. Either choice would have put them in the midst of trackless mountain in a maze of tangled canyons. From either location, traveling northwest, as they had told they must, they would have entered the wilderness of the Uinta Basin instead of the Mormon valleys of the Wasatch Front. However it happened, William Sterrett tells of hard times. The men had only 3 days' rations to see them through the mountain. By the fourth day, they were hunting for their supper while they traveled. The best they could do was a few prairie chickens, duck, and geese. While hunting, they almost had a fatal accident. Alan Huntington dropped his revolver on the hammer of his rifle, causing the weapon to discharge. The rifle ball went through the collar of his shirt before making a hole in the brim of his hat near his ear. He wasn't hurt, but his face was burned with hot powder residue, and that was probably deafening. According to Sterrett's journal, we got entirely out of provisions and went 4 days without eating. We then ripped off our moccasin soles, which were made of rawhide, roasted them, but it was poor food. Also killed a small dog that followed us and ate him. By this time, we became so weak that we could not hunt for game. Our horses were becoming jaded as well as ourselves. We were, in a manner, barefoot as well as terribly discouraged. We knew that we must travel northwest to get to the valleys, but the prospect was discouraging. For when we climbed to the highest peak, there were a dozen more ahead of us, higher than the one we were on. This description sounds like the country along the top of the Wasatch Mountains surrounding Strawberry Reservoir, Daniels Summit, and the Current Creek. As good viewpoint is the top of Aventequin Canyon, where Highway 191 crests Reservation Ridge. Somewhere and somehow the men crossed the divide between Castle Valley and Uinta Basin, dropping down the north slope of the Reservation Ridge to enter the Strawberry River, or more probably the Duchesne River, the real Duchesne River. At that point, they must have been terribly confused. In their minds, they had left the Duchesne River, which was Price River, in Castle Valley. North of the Duchesne River, there wasn't supposed to be another river of any size, other than the Green River. Once in the Uinta Basin, it's probable the men followed the Duchesne River thinking it was the Green River. So when William Sterrett told the Deseret News he found the Indians on the Green River, he had probably found Indians on the Duchesne River. The man was lost. He didn't know where he was. William Sterrett continues his narrative. We at last came to an Indian encampment on the Green River, which is probably the Duchesne River. One of our party went on ahead to the camp, and being a good interpreter, told them who we were, also that we were starving, and told of our troubles with the Indians on the Grand River, which came very near to losing us our scalps. Anyone who knows anything about Indian natures knows that if you have trouble with one, all are angry. And as the whole story was told, that we had killed some of them and that they had killed 3 of our brethren, they naturally became angry. The chief of this band was called Black Pine. When we got to their camp, they treated us kindly and gave us a little bread. After an hour or so, they gave us a little more. Then in the afternoon, they set out a camp kettle full of deer meat, boiled to rages, and told us to eat all we wanted. This was done and suffered no inconvenience. The chief put our traps, meaning our things, in his lodge, told us to make our beds by the side of his lodge, which we done. We lay down to sleep, not apprehending any danger, but a kind providence was watching over us. The Indians went into council until about 12 o'clock whether to kill us or not. Every Indian but the chief was in favor of taking our scalps. Their argument was that we had killed some of their kindred and we deserved to die. However, the chief prevailed, and we were allowed to live. It is surprising that the white men were allowed to live. From information Sterrett gives in his next few sentences, this band of Uinta Utes was closely aligned with White Eye and his band, who had driven these same men from Elk Mountain Fort. Had this group of Indians received word of the fight only a day or two sooner from a member of their own tribe, the 3 lost missionaries might have been missing forever. But William Sterrett said it well, a kind providence was watching over us. The Sterrett saga continues. The next morning we left our Indian friends, they giving us a small sack of dried meat, and told us to go up the river about 20 miles, and there we would strike a trail made in the spring by White Eye's band. But as usual with us, when we got there, the trail was not in sight. Here is solid evidence that the Indian camp was on the Duchesne River and not the Green River. 20 miles west of the river to a trail that would have taken them up to Utah Valley could only mean the Indian camp was somewhere near the confluence of the Duchesne and Strawberry Rivers, probably near the modern town of Duchesne. Had they been on the Green River, they would have had traveled 50 miles or more to reach the upper Strawberry Valley, where such a trail might have been evident. In 1776, Spanish explorers Dominguez and Escalante entered Utah Valley from Spanish Fork Canyon after crossing the Uinta Basin. They entered Spanish Fork Canyon from the Diamond Fork tributary that begins on the divide between the upper Strawberry and the south-facing Diamond Fork Canyon. The old Dominguez-Escalante trail was probably the route Chief Black Pine had tried to direct the lost missionaries to. Sterrett concludes, again we were thrown to our own reserves. Suffice to say that we made our way slowly to the headwaters of the Provo River. Footsore, almost naked and weary, here we knew not where we were, and at this particular point the canyon seemed to turn to the south. We knew that was not our direction. We were in quite a quandary which way to go. We killed one of our horses and dried part for future use. That night I retired apart from the brethren and besought the Lord in prayer that he would show me the way out. The answer came in a dream. To go down the stream. In the morning I told my dream, and they were willing. We packed one horse and rode one, 2 of us on foot, and on the second day reached Provo City, where the people came very near to killing us with kindness. Reached Salt Lake City on the 20th day of October, where we found our families and friends in a state of great excitement. President Brigham Young had white men and Indians scouring the South in all directions. We were in the mountains 24 days. My weight when I got home was 115 pounds. My usual weight being 155 pounds. End of mission. Wow. Wow. Yeah. A 40-pound deficit? That's pretty bad. But do you see what I mean? there's definitely the hand of Providence in a lot of these things. I think it's for the benefit of both the natives and the missionaries. Like the chief sparing them, the Lord watching over them. It's, yeah. From the description given, it would appear that they had continued up the Strawberry River to near the headwaters, then continued northwest in the mountains to the unsettled Heber Valley. There they discovered the upper Provo River veering south. By the time these men were out of the mountains and home with their families, all other members of the Elk Mountain Mission had been home for 3 weeks or more. Next is Alone in the Mountain. Yeah, we can do this one as well. Indian Canyon, on the northeastern side of the divide between Castle Valley and the Uintas Basin, a few miles south of the Cheyenne River. This is an author's photo, and then here you have William Wilson Sterrett. So this is the... So this is the person who was writing and some of the stuff that they had to traverse. So here's who was writing. Here's what they had to traverse. All right, now for the man that followed the first group but was left alone on the mountain. In the panic and haste of fleeing from the marauding Indians, another man was lost and left on the mountain. On the morning of September 30th, Alfred Billings' party was at the top of Rock Canyon, following Arapine's trail over the mountain to Manti. From their camp on Big Bear Creek, one more day's travel would put them over the top of the divide into Manti Canyon and home. The men were still in a desperate hurry. They had to warn other travelers and tell the tragedy that had befallen the mission. At daylight, the men broke camp and started west through the mountains. But after only going 3 or 4 miles, John McEwen's horse gave out as they climbed toward the crest of the summit. McEwen was taking 3 horses back to the settlements, a mare and 2 colts, that were too young to ride. He stopped to let his saddle horse rest, keeping the colts nearby. Alfred Billings and other missionaries went on ahead without looking back. After resting for a while, McEwen again took the trail, hoping to catch up, but his horse still couldn't carry him, and he had to lead the animal while walking ahead on foot. Progress was slow. Soon he reached a flat place at the top of the ridge where there was a lot of grass. He lost the trail. This was somewhat disconcerting because he hadn't seen or heard from the rest of the party for a few hours. After circling, looking for his tracks and not finding any, he began to panic. Anxiously, McEwen began calling out to his companions, hearing nothing in return but the echo of his own voice in the canyons. Wildly, he searched for the trail, becoming more desperate and fearful with each passing minute. Panic-stricken and choked with anxiety, he turned his horse loose so he could walk faster, and he began to run through the grass, desperate to find the trail. In shock, he realized that he was all alone, somewhere on top of the mountain, unsure of where to go or what to do. In his frantic search, he continued in the direction he was pointed when he last knew he was following the trail toward the skyline of the mountain, bearing northwest. Soon the ground began to slope downward into a canyon. McEwen continued his flight, scrambling down a steep, timbered grade into a small creek below. At this point, the wilderness closed in around him, and his panic was without reason. He stumbled forward, mindless of the thorns, bush, deadfall, and rocks along the creek. From deep in the canyon, he didn't notice that the creek was taking him northeast in the wrong direction. McEwen had lost the trail somewhere near Cox Knoll, an elevation of 10,459 feet. They had dropped down into Upper Seeley Creek above Pete's Hole. He said travel along the creek bank was impossible because of the tangle of bush and thorns, so he walked down the bottom of the creek in the cold water for 5 or 6 miles. Then, exhausted, I laid myself under a big rock, wet, tired, and hungry, chilly all night. Toward morning, I kindled fire, slept very little. By morning, he had to know he was nowhere near the trail his companions had taken. But, incredibly, instead of going back up the ridge to his horses, where he had lost the trail, he continued down the canyon, following Seeley Creek. He was obviously disoriented and didn't realize he was traveling east on his way to Joe's Valley and the site of the modern reservoir. McEwen doesn't mention crossing the open grassy meadows of Joseph's Valley or of seeing the confluence of Seeley and Lowery watery creeks. Possibly he was in such a fretful stupor, walking in the creek channel bounded by willows and trees, he didn't notice the change of topography on the east side of Joe's Valley. He continued down Straight Canyon and Sweet Cottonwood Creek. Luckily, it was early October and the water was near its lowest level of the year. Had the creek been full, he likely would have drowned in the swift currents and deep pools with submerged rocks and snags. Down the mountain stream he fled, mindlessly stumbling forward, going in a wrong direction and not knowing. He said he traveled 20 miles that day, walking down the bottom of the creek. Modern maps confirm the mileage, and in a perfect description of the creek in Straight Canyon, he said, "I tried to travel some on the bank, but the bush was so thick that I tore my pants off above the knees." McEwen broke free of the mountain and staggered out of Straight Canyon in the late afternoon, just a few miles west of where the town of Orangeville is today. He had made an astonishing time in the miles he had traveled and the conditions he had traveled under. When he reached the foothills, he was so groggy and overcome with fatigue he didn't recognize where he was. He later wrote in his journal, "When I arrived at the mouth of the canyon, a valley presented itself to view. Could not recollect where I was." His confusion was complete. When he began following Steely Creek the day before, if he thought at all, he thought he was going west into Sanpete Valley. But now, after traveling 30 miles and coming out of the canyon, he was back in Castle Valley on the wrong side of the mountain. No wonder he didn't recognize where he was. He continued, "Laid myself down and rested about 2 hours, thence traveled some 5 or 6 miles in a southern course. I got to be tremendous thirsty, weak and faint, having nothing to eat, seeing no signs of water. I knelt down and prayed to my Father in heaven to give me strength and grace according to my faith and preserve my life. I exercised my faith in God. I thought of my wife and children, companions and friends. Language is not sufficient to express all my feelings of anguish and anxiety, knowing I could not get along well without water. I conclude to return back to the creek. On my way back to the creek, I came to an old trail, which I kept. It prevented me from climbing the hills. I arrived at the creek after dark, very much fatigued and awful hungry. I took a drink of water, then knelt down and prayed to God to deliver me from my situation, to give me a dream and show unto me what course to pursue in the morning. I laid myself down in the brush, chilly at night, very little sleep. Shook nearly all night like an aspen leaf. During the night, I had a dream. The Indian trail which I had traveled along was plainly shown to me. The next day was Tuesday, the 2nd day of October. Believing that God had answered his prayers, and by showing him the path to follow, John McEwen, by faith and fatigue, was more calm and reasoned as he took God's path to his destiny. He still had no idea where he was or where he was going. Describing the day's adventure, he wrote, "I started at daylight, taking the Indian trail, the one he had on the night before, and traveled 10 or 13 miles in a southwest course when I came across our trail in Castle Valley, where we had been on Friday the 28th of September. I felt greatly relieved and rejoiced having found where I was and praised the name of deity." McEwen was back at the bottom of Rock Canyon on Arapine's trail. It must have been a shock to him when he became aware that he had traveled a 50-mile loop back to the bottom of a mountain he had climbed a few days before, but he was happy. I don't think he was that shocked. I think he was just dang happy. Have you ever had even the slightest hint of being lost? Finding anything makes you happy. You don't sit there and go, "Oh, I'm shocked. I can't believe I'm here." No, you're like, "Oh, thank heavens." From this point, he could follow the trail to where he had left his horses. His journal continues. "I felt convinced in my own mind that my life would be preserved, and that I would arrive safe in the settlements. Hunger seemed to leave me, as it were, but I was thirsty very often. I proceeded along our trail up a creek, water brackish, then up the canyon, then up the mountain. Being weak, I was obliged to rest every few rods whilst I was climbing the mountains. I succeeded in reaching the top safe, where I rested myself for nearly 1 hour and refreshed myself by drinking some rainwater which was lodged in the rocks." His last sentence here might give a clue about why he had traveled so far in the wrong direction. If there was rainwater in the rocks, the sky was probably overcast and stormy. During the 2 days he had fled down Steely and Cottonwood creeks. Lost and not able to see the sun, he had no way to orient himself other than up and down. He thought down would take him to the Sanpete Valley, but he was wrong. Now he had to climb the mountain a second time, this time on foot with waterlogged leather boots. Being anxious to reach Manti City, I again resumed my journey. Although I did not feel able to travel, the trail is not traveled as a general thing by the Indians, only by Arapine and his band, and a person not acquainted with the trail would be very apt to lose it. Much more a perfect stranger, however, knowing the course but for several miles I continued traveling till dark, and camped at a small spring on the mountains. I kindled a fire, and kept it up all night, yet I could not keep warm and comfortable, but shook as though the chill before was retiring to my sleep. I prayed. It seemed to me, as my mind was on the stretch of all the time, that sleep and hunger had forsaken me. Next morning was 3rd of October, 1855. At daylight, I knelt myself down and prayed to God, exercising all the faith I had, asking him that I might this day meet some of the brethren from the settlements so I could obtain something to eat, as I began to feel myself very weak. After which I resumed my journey and traveled some 8 or 10 miles and arrived at a place where I had lost the trail. I examined carefully all around, and saw plenty of signs, such as the prints of cattle and horses' feet, and some footsteps, and some being a foot going over the mountain or knoll leading down toward the creek. McEwen had completed a circle measuring roughly 70 miles, and had done it in 3 days and nights on foot without eating, a remarkable feat. His journal entry for that day also confirms, by the cattle tracks he said he found, that Alfred Billings and party had also pushed the 8 oxen retrieved by St. John's brother all the way to Manti, another remarkable feat considering how fast they were traveling. Then, by the way this journal entry is written, it might not have occurred to McEwen even later, while he was writing his journal, that the footprints he found going over the mountain or knoll leading downwards to the creek were his own. A sad way to tie the two ends of a circle together. It is surprising, judging from his starved and weakened condition, both physically and mentally, that he didn't try to follow the footsteps he had found. Had he done so, he would have started a second lap of his circle, expecting to follow his own tracks to safety. It is a common thing for people lost in the wilderness to do. McEwen continued, "Not seeing sufficient to justify me, I knelt down and prayed to God, desiring of him to lead and guide me by his Spirit, so that I might find the right trail. After I arose from my knees, I went back on the trail and found where the most tracks were. I turned about and endeavored to keep it, which I fortunately did. I turned and followed around a bluff or hill leading into a thick growth of quake and aspen poles, at the entrance of which the soil was loose and the growth bare, about 4 feet long, which showed the trail and signs distinctly. I felt this was the right course to pursue, and thanked God." The bluff or hills he speaks of was probably Cox Knoll. "I proceeded over some 3 miles, arriving in an open place on the trail on the side of the mountain. I turned my face around and viewed the different peaks and the blank between 2 creeks, the space between 2 creeks where I traveled on Sunday morning last. He was just under the skyline near the crest of the mountain, probably looking down on the confluence of Steely and Olson Creek. Whilst thus engaged and hearing my name called, I turned my head and looked toward the places where I thought the sound came from. I saw some horsemen. Saw Indians with them, some 8 or 10 rods ahead of me on the trail. He was indeed back on Arapine's trail, following the path the other missionaries had taken. Had he kept going, he would have reached Manti on his own, or died trying. I shook as though I had been shot when my name was called. It came so unexpected. They came up to where I was standing and spoke to me. What strength I had instantly left me, and I wilted to the ground. They asked me a few questions, which I answered. I then asked if they had water in their canteens. They said no. They gave me a small piece of bread, which I ate, but not eagerly. They being 5 in number, 3 whites and 2 Indians of Arapine's band, I felt so full that I cannot express the feelings of joy that I had, for language is not sufficient to portray the same. I also thank God for answering my prayers. Their names were Nathaniel Beach and John Lowry, Jr., both of Manti City, and Lyman L. Woods of Provo City. The rescue party took McEwen back down the east side of the mountain to a creek where they could get water, probably the headwaters of Cove Creek, a mile or 2 above McEwen Flat, named in honor of John McEwen. There, McEwen had a little more to eat, and he rested for about 3 hours while the rescue party found his lost horses, saddle, and bedroll. He was so weak they had to help him in the saddle. They traveled 8 or 10 miles late that afternoon and camped after dark at a spring on the west side of the divide in Upper Manti Canyon. From where they camped that night, a good wagon road went straight to the town of Manti. The rescue party didn't leave Manti to search for McEwen until late Tuesday night. He'd been missing since Sunday morning. By the time the rescuers were on their way, the lost man was huddled around a fire at the foot of Wagon Road Ridge, almost back to where his odyssey had begun. Wow. The search party found him on the trail of Manti about noon on Wednesday. That none of his mission companions made any effort to go back to look for him is one of the darkest pages in the mission's history. The fact that his mission president had supposed friends had abandoned McEwen was not lost on the good people of Manti. Alfred Billings had some tough questions to answer. Some of his answers were creative. Of the controversy, McEwen wrote, "I heard the two boys from Manti talking while lying in their bedrolls the night before they reached Manti, the substance of which was John Lowry Jr. said, when he heard that I was lost and left behind, he was sick in bed, could not feel satisfied or contented. The other, Nathaniel Beach, said he felt the same. He said Arapeen and his Indians felt bad also. The universal feeling of citizens of Manti was that they felt worse for me than they did for those that was killed by the Indians at Elk Mountain. Reason was I was left behind alive in the mountains, might perish, die, and be devoured by wild animals, and that would be the last of the tidings they might hear of my fate." At daybreak, the men saddled up and followed the wagon road to Manti. As they approached the town, the rescuers fired a few shots to alert the townspeople of their successful return. McEwen wrote, "Quite a lot of the citizens were gathered together. They seemed so glad, and it deserved to be a day of thanksgiving by them for my safety. I never did see the same spirit and feeling manifested before by any community, and I must say that the same feeling of joy came upon me on beholding, being preserved and once more safe in the settlements of the saints." Thus ended John McEwen's journal of the Elk Mountain Mission. So, I hope the author, here's the McEwen Flat and the Lower Wagon Road Ridge left skyline. You can kind of see. And John McEwen himself. I hope the author, so here's the skyline that he's talking about, and there's John McEwen. I hope the author actually talks about how Alfred Billings tried to make things up. I suspect that's what's coming next at the end of it all, and then the epilogue, which we will do next time. Although, I mean, let's see here. No, I could, this is actually short enough. I might be able to get through it. I want to see what's coming up here. Alfred Billings and 8 of his men arrived in Manti just before dark on September 30th, 1855. Over the next few days, everything was in turmoil. John McEwen was missing, and there was no word from the 3 men who took the Spanish Fork Trail to Utah Valley. They had failed to arrive as expected. No one knew where they were or what might have happened to them. The story of the Indian uprising was spreading through the Utah Territory like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know how such a thing could happen. Everyone, including Brigham Young, had heard nothing but glowing reports of how the mission was prospering. People were asking embarrassing questions. Alfred Billings had some explaining to do. Within 24 hours of Alfred Billings arriving in Manti, 3 letters were sent to Brigham Young from central Utah telling of the tragedy. Alfred Billings dictated one of those letters to the Manti city clerk, John Eager, who forwarded it to Brigham Young. This letter gives a quick outline of the events in the Elk Mountain Fork and offers a few items of information not found elsewhere. The first is that Brother Alfred, it says Brother A.M. Billings, had one of his forefingers shot off while in the act of conveying Brother Hunt to the fort. Evidently, the mission president's mangled finger had been amputated, probably with a hunting knife, while the men were still en route to the settlements. The letter also says Brother Wise, James Hunt, lingered about 13 hours before he died. They did not have time to bury him, being hurried off for the fear of more being killed. The old chief that brought them, the cows, promised to bury the 3 brothers that was shot. As mentioned earlier, no one else recorded hearing the Indian say that. Maybe wishful thinking. What are you kiddies doing? They're going after one of the magnets that they took down. Okay. That same day, October 1st, the mayor of the neighboring town, Nephi, penned a short epistle to Brigham Young. Miles Miller gave a description of the events as he understood them, then added some things he had heard about John McEwen. Brother Billings got in Manti with 12 men. It was actually 8 men. One of them was left on the road, being sick. The brethren, having hardly no provisions with them, starting in a hurry, had to go on and could not stay with him. The fact that John McEwen had been left on the mountain was causing quite a stir in the little frontier communities. Another letter sent to Brigham Young on the 1st of October was from Salt Creek in Salina Canyon. The author was Alfred Higgins. Salt Creek is where Oliver Huntington was camped with Bishop David Evans and his White Mountain missionaries, recently reassigned on their way to the Elk Mountain Mission. It is not known what this letter had to say. A copy has yet to be found. But it aroused the ire of Alfred Billings quickly enough. When he heard about it, Billings dispatched a short note to Brigham Young immediately. Again, possibly because he has his swollen hand, Alfred Billings had John Eager act as scribe. The note said, Brother John McEwen languished behind and took some other trails and has been lost, and there is now men out in search of him, as he is not more than 12 miles off. The report of Alfred Higgins as sent to you from Salt Creek by him, has given on his own responsibility, as it may be very incorrect and without the consent of the authorities here. He, Higgins, was merely sent to Salt Creek to ascertain the cause of the detention of the mail. Everything told about John McEwen in the correspondence to Brigham Young was not true. Alfred Billings and maybe some of his missionaries were beginning to hide the truth to cover up their shameful behavior. First, okay, yes, or it could be that they were also trying to be hopeful. But either way. First, John McEwen was not sick, and the reason he was abandoned was not that the missionaries were short of food and in the danger of starving. Alfred Billings and party had plenty of food to see them to Manti. They had pack horses and with supplies, and St. John's brother had butchered 3 steers and given them a good quantity of beef at Courthouse Spring. They were also herding 8 fat oxen, a traveling food supply should the need arise. Then John McEwen didn't languish behind. He was dismounted and having trouble with his horse. He couldn't keep up, and his companions chose not to wait for him. He didn't wander off on other trails. He missed the trail completely, and no one was there to help him. And the statement he was no more than 12 miles off, and the men were then out looking for him, was absolutely false. No one went out looking for McEwen until Tuesday evening, October 2nd. No one had seen him since Sunday morning, 3 days previous. When Billings wrote his note to Brigham Young, no one was looking for John McEwen yet. How does the author know this? What if there were people who were just barely starting? Look, I get it. Alfred Billings is screwed up in every way possible, and what he is saying does not square with what he had. I get it. So, but at the same time, I don't know. I know people who have been in the same situation. I've seen their actions, and yes, it is very well, could be exactly as the author describes, that he was just trying to cover up his shameful behavior. In the mind of the person who's doing that, they're still in panic mode. And they don't want to face the truth. And they are continuing to do things wrong. So, he is trying to make assumptions, make guesswork of what was going on, instead of having the backbone to say what actually happened, or the clear appraisal of things. It's I don't know. To me, I've become sympathetic to him. And it is true, he's still doing everything wrong. But yeah, maybe it's just because I know that, well, we'll see what happens. I just feel a little sympathetic. Everything he's doing is really wrong. And there's no bones about that. So, but no one went out until October 2nd. So if no one had gone out by October 2nd, I'm trying to figure out he must have some source for saying that no one was out by that time, that there was some sort of journal somewhere in Manti that kept that, but we'll see. So, and then the men who did go looking for him were Arapahoes, Indians, and volunteers from the local towns, none of them members of the Elk Mountain Mission. Oliver Huntington, Bishop David Evans, and the men of the White Mountain Mission gathered back in Manti to wait for instructions. Meetings were held among the local church and civic leaders about the possible courses of action. Arapahoes was consulted about using his influence to smooth relations with the Elk Mountain Utes. After all, his recent treaty between the Utes, Navajos, and Mormons had been a success. For at least a month or more, the Mormons had no one other than Arapahoes to help broker a ceasefire. Arapahoes was happy to give Mormons advice. He told the council that the Mormons had plenty of women and children, and they should stay home and take care of them, and not go to the Elk Mountains. He said no one could speak for all of the Utes, and he didn't think he could gather all of the Utes together. When he was with the Elk Mountain Utes, he was their chief, but when he was not with them, they didn't listen to him. He said the Elk Mountain Utes were a bad people, and now that blood had been shed and some of them had been killed, he didn't think any of them would listen to him. He said he didn't think the Elk Mountain people would be friendly again until they ran out of ammunition, maybe in 2 or 3 years. He thought the Mormons and Americans should keep their powder from the bad Utes and only give it to him and his people, who were always talked good to the Mormons. He suggested that instead of trying to make peace, the Mormons should recruit the Snake or Shoshone Indians and go and kill all of the Elk Mountain Utes and steal their horses. Well, that's one way of doing things. Wow. Arapahoes' 3 pages of advice were recorded by the city clerk, John Eager, and forwarded to Brigham Young. The letter painfully reveals the differences between the mindsets of the two cultures. It also reveals that it didn't seem to make a difference to anyone that the Elk Mountain Utes were not the people who started the fight. What? It didn't seem to make a difference to anyone that the Elk Mountain Utes were not the people who started the fight. Oh, it was the specific White Eyes band that was among the Elk Mountain Utes. To Arapahoes and the Mormons, the Elk Mountain Utes were bad people because the Mormons were driven out of their valley. David Evans, president of the White Mountain Missionaries, wrote a letter to Brigham Young from Manti expressing his availability should the church president want him to go ahead to the Elk Mountain Valley. His faith, loyalty, and willingness to do whatever Brigham Young asked of him was inspiring, but foolhardy in the face of the Indian insurrection. Bishop Evans and his men were evidently told to stand down and go home. It is surprising that Brigham Young didn't undertake immediate action to reclaim the Mormon fort and replant the ensign of the church and territory in the Elk Mountain Valley. The Lion of the Lord, Brigham Young, usually didn't give up so easily, but then, by the time the word of the disaster had reached Salt Lake City, it was the first week of October, and everyone knew the high mountain passes to Cache Valley could be closed by snow at any time. It would be irresponsible to send Bishop Evans and the White Mountain Mission people alone to face the wrath of rampaging Indians. It might take weeks to get units of the Nauvoo Legion ready to deploy. Prudence dictated that any action be delayed until the following spring and better weather. But by then, not even Brigham Young was prepared to take the necessary steps, expense, and effort it would require to organize a new mission and the military expedition it would take to reclaim the lost territory. The prospect of a full Indian war was not worth the risk and the trouble to take back what had been lost. Alfred Billings probably got an earful when he reported in person at the church headquarters in Salt Lake City. Brigham Young might have asked him to explain why the mission president had remained safely at home with his family while 4 of his men remained unaccounted for somewhere in the wilds of the Wasatch Mountains. The burden of how these men became lost and left behind rested squarely on the shoulders of the mission president. Yeah. Frankly. I mean, it's just... I think the reason I feel for him is because it was such an immense failure. And then, to top it all off, it compounded the immense failure. It's like being kicked while you're down. And that's really down. And it's true. It's true. And the sad thing is that because I can see it from him as just a normal, regular guy point of view, it's painful. Because you're like, dude, you should, we'll do the armchair quarterbacking here in a moment. Then the unpleasant fact that 3 of his missionaries had been left dead and unburied in the Elk Mountain Valley to the mercy of the coyotes and ravages of nature was likely a topic of discussion. Families of the men killed deserved an honest explanation. The loss of property, damaged relations with the Indians, and damaged reputation of the church's missionary program were likely discussed as well. Then, of course, there was the matter of how the strength of the mission had been reduced to just 13 able-bodied men before the fort was attacked. No record of Brigham Young's meeting with Alfred Billings has been found. Perhaps Brigham Young didn't want his words recorded. Then there is no record that Brigham Young ever knew about the Alfred Billings Trading Company. Had he known, the mission president might have been summoned to face a church disciplinary council. Incompetence was one matter, willful dereliction of duty something else again. It can be argued that the fort was left short-handed and vulnerable because the traders were sent home to get more trade goods for the company. Yes, that's true. But again, did they see the trading company as part of their mandate? Jeez. I feel like I'm an advocate for someone who is just guilty of sin. I really do. I'm like, geez Louise. He's very guilty for being a regular human being when something better was needed of the man. The missionaries who participated in the company were culpable as well, and there might have been a pact of silence among them. The trading company is not mentioned in any of their journals or memoirs. Ethan Petit's journal beginning August 22nd remains the only source of the information about the company and some of the members. The topic was such a sensitive issue that 40 years later, in 1895, Oliver Huntington still wouldn't mention the company when publicly criticizing other members of the mission for trading with the Indians. Is he reading between the lines? You know, it could have been, the trading company could have just been one man's joke of, hey, what are we going to call this expedition? Oh, the Alfred Billings Trading Company. That is a possibility as well. Especially if none of the rest of them mention it at all. Even Oliver Huntington, who was continually critical. So, where does the evidence lie on that? I'm sorry, I really do feel like I'm like trying to run as a defense lawyer for the accused. In the end, the broken walls of the Elk Mountain Fort, the dream of an Indian mission, and a strong Mormon presence in the Old Spanish Trail was shattered and scattered to dust. The Elk Mountain Valley would remain the exclusive domain of the Sharebeck Utes for another 20 years. And the Elk Mountain Fort, as it appeared about 1900, used by permission from the Moab Museum. So that's how it looked at 1900, which would be 45 years after the incident, so 25 more years since then, so that's how they had built it. Epilogue is tiny. Brigham Young didn't try to resettle the Elk Mountain Valley. Southeast Utah remained one of the wildest, most inaccessible, and unexplored parts of the American West until the uranium boom of the late 1940s. After the Mormons retreated, the valley became a hideout and safe haven for large bands of non-reservation Indians. During Utah's Black Hawk Indian War of the 1860s, the Elk Mountain Valley became the headquarters of Antonga Black Hawk and his Ute horse soldiers who raided Mormon farms and ranches throughout the Utah Territory. Large herds of stolen cattle and horses were driven over the old Spanish Trail to the Elk Mountain area, where they could easily be hidden, pastured, and kept safe until they could be sold in Colorado, New Mexico, or Wyoming. Safe in his Elk Mountain sanctuary, Chief Black Hawk put together a formidable coalition of Utes, Paiutes, even a few Navajos who had escaped Colonel Kit Carson's roundup and imprisonment of the Navajos in 1863. Incredibly, the white man who started the Black Hawk War by insulting and beating a prominent young Ute, Jake Arapine, son of Chief Arapine, was none other than John Lowry, the former high-profile member of the Elk Mountain Mission. The Black Hawk War began in 1865 and continued with varying degrees of intensity until it was finally stopped by the arrival of federal troops in 1872. In 1872, John Wesley Powell, the famous river explorer, made contact with a band of Utes from Elk Mountain area. He described them as a wild, daring people and very skilled in border warfare. It may be stated that for the last 10 years they have subsisted chiefly on the spoils of war. In 1875, inspired by the tales of beautiful Elk Mountain Valley, probably told by former members of the Elk Mountain Mission, a very brave man named Crispin Taylor took a herd of cattle there. Encouraging hostile Indians, he had to run for his life. Encountering hostile Indians, he had to run for his life, forfeiting his cattle and his dream of establishing a ranch. Taylor was persistent and went back in 1881 with his extended family to successfully build houses, farms, and ranches. Early 1876, the Green brothers, George and Silas, came from the Wasatch Valleys to try their luck at cattle ranching. They persisted until the winter of 1876 and 77, and then they disappeared. The body of Silas was recovered the next spring. He had been killed by Indians. George was never found. The killing of the Green brothers was the last recorded incident involving the Schaerbeek Utes. Sometime after John Wesley Powell passed through the area in 1872, perhaps as early as 1873, the angel of death visited the Elk Mountain Valley and stayed for a few years. A smallpox epidemic of biblical proportions cut a swath through the region, leaving only death and desolation behind. By the time the shadow of death was lifted from the valley, the Schaerbeek Utes were no more. The few destitute, starving, and pox-scarred survivors were assimilated among the neighboring Ute tribes, completely losing their identity as a distinct, cohesive band. When the first white homesteaders crossed the river in the late 1870s and early 1880s, they found Elk Mountain Valley empty. Only the wind in the ledges whispered of the many thousands of souls who had occupied the valley for thousands of years before. In late 1877, 2 prospectors took up residency in the valley. They were William Grandstaff, a former slave, and a mysterious Frenchman who kept his name well hidden as his background. Negro Bill and Frenchie occupied the old Mormon fort, planted a garden, and lived in the valley for a few years free of Indian troubles. They found some of the cows belonging to the deceased Green brothers, and with these, Grandstaff started a herd and kept hidden in a canyon east of Moab that still bears his name. The fact that there were free-roaming cattle wandering the valley when the 2 men first got there helps to document the complete extinction of the Elk Mountain Schaerbeek Utes by that time, in 1877. The first farmers and ranchers began arriving in 1878, and by the early 1880s, the Elk Mountain Valley was developing into a typical frontier settlement. The first town site was the Upper Valley near Chief St. John's old village and farm. The settlers called the place Plainfield, but in the early 1900s, the fields began to dry up from lack of water, and it became known as Poverty Flats, a name that still endures. The town that developed in the lower valley was closer to the river and the old Mormon fort. The early settlers found the old fort to be a treasure of easy-to-acquire dressed stone, and over the years the whole structure was carried away to build frontier homes and outbuildings, which is very common. It just cannibalized the old stuff. Nothing remains today. Even the exact location is a topic for debate. The town in the lower valley was eventually named Moab. It is a biblical name. In the Old Testament, the land of Moab was beyond the River Jordan, in the southeast side of the Dead Sea. It was a desert region on the fringe of the Promised Land at the edge of the wilderness. The Elk Mountain Valley was also a desert region at the edge of the wilderness on the fringe of Brigham Young's Promised Land of Utah. Many of the early settlers of Moab were Mormons, though the town was one of the few in Utah not settled under the direction of the Mormon Church. The Mormons saw many similarities between Utah and the Promised Land of the Bible. In the valleys of Utah, the geography is amazingly similar to the land of Israel. There is a great Salt Lake, very similar to the Dead Sea. And the Salt Lake is connected to Utah's Sea of Galilee, the Utah Lake. And by Utah's, we'll see you, dearie, love you. By Utah's River Jordan, named by the Mormons because of its similarity to Israel's River Jordan. And far to the southeast of the lakes and settled valleys of the northern Utah is a vast uncharted wilderness of desert and sand. To the Mormons it became the land of Moab. Over the years, the Elk Mountain Valley became known as Grand Valley, in honor of the Grand Colorado River. Eventually it became Spanish Valley. Utah's Elk Mountain became known as La Salle Mountain, and the Grand River became the Colorado River by an act of Congress in 1921. The Daughters of the Utah Pioneers erected a monument near the site of the old Mormon fort in 1940. In 2006, the monument was moved when the property was sold. In October 2010, the Elk Mountain Mission Memorial was rededicated. Today, it rests next to the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers building on the East Center Street in Moab. More than just a bronze plaque commemorating an event, the marker also serves as an unofficial gravestone for the 3 missionaries who were killed during the Elk Mountain Uprising, whose bodies were never recovered and their remains never found. Moab became the uranium capital of the world during the uranium boom of the 1950s, following World War II. The entire area was the location of America's last big gold rush, when thousands of hopeful prospectors flocked to the area to search for radioactive uranium, the key ingredient of nuclear bombs. In the last quarter of the 20th century, largely because of the writings of Edward Abbey and the nearby national parks, Moab became a major tourist destination. Today, people come from all over the world to see the magnificent scenery, visit many national parks and national monuments, and enjoy the red rock backcountry. Since the early 1970s, Utah's land of desolation has become the land of bountiful for the tourist industry. In 1854, William Dresser Huntington and his exploring party could never have imagined it. And here is a picture of St. Louis Rock at Cane Springs, south of Moab. It's a camping spot on the old Spanish Trail used by the Elk Mountain missionaries on their way to and from the Navajos. It now sits beside Highway 191 and contains a rest stop, gift shop, and museum store. The white arrow and the words "Hole in the Rock" are painted on the rock. Note the Jeep or ATV anchored to the rock above the white arrow, which is this tiny little speck. So you will see this if you keep going south from Moab, like when you're on your way to Monticello or to Cortez, Colorado, or the still Navajo region in Utah. All right, time for one of the most important, yet I always find ironically kind of terrible things, the armchair quarterbacking of what could Alfred Billings, having done everything so wrong, could have done better. First of all, yes, when they were retreating in a panic, he could have made sure he had all his men, instead of just slapping across the river and going on. Not being able to bury the 3 men, there really was nothing that they could do. The 2 men were out hunting. We don't know where they were hunting. We don't know what the Utes had done with their bodies. So 2 of them, nothing could have been done. The last one, they were facing a mob. And because they had said they were making peace, the mob surrounded them. So, yeah, there really was not time to bury him. All right, so he could have retreated with all men in tow instead of possibly leaving one behind, instead of every man for himself. When they were on the trail and decided to split, he absolutely should have had people who had taken the trails before go on the trails that they needed to go on. And that when McEwen was up on the mountain and about to do his 70-mile circuitous route, they should have stopped for him. They had plenty of time, energy, food, etc. The ones that were going north to try and make it to that got lost in the Uinta Basin, they should have split the resources. So armchair quarterbacking, send people who knew the trail, emphasize always sticking together, make sure that they had some of the mobile food. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Maybe I don't know if they had thought of that or not, or thought it was impractical. There's a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know if they discussed the different options and what they thought they could achieve or get done. I think it's fascinating that I'm just trying to think from their perspective. How could they have known about the Indian discontent and the malcontents among them? In some ways, the worst that they did was the fact that they just became so few in number. I would probably rephrase that they traded arms and ammunition plus got so few in number. Because otherwise, the Indians were stealing from them. Okay, if that's true, it seems like they were kind of expecting it. You don't see, you just see it mentioned in their journals, and it's just kind of upsetting, but they had a plan, and they were going to get more people, but the problem was is that they became too few in number, and they traded too many arms. I mean, unless you were very observant, knew Indian culture, or other things like that, I think it's pretty hard to figure out that they would have been attacking. I mean, other than their strange behavior just leading up to that time. But again, it's okay, so the biggest problems were losing the people to trading instead of having it stay manned. At the same time, they did need supplies. Unfortunately, they should have asked for food supplies, and they should have relocated the fort. I mean, they should have thought about that, but of course they weren't military men, and they didn't know they would have needed to use it. They probably thought it was more just a thing of show and shelter. But with all the cascading failures, followed by the panicked retreat, and just to top it all off, the absolute train wreck of a retreat, followed by the then panicked correspondence and other things like that, it was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster for Alfred Billings. And at the same time, I still want to defend him as best as I can. Like, if you've ever seen the movie Bridge of Spies, I watched that twice recently. The main character in that movie is tasked to defend a communist spy during the Cold War, which obviously was not a happy or good thing to do. And he pointed out certain things in the case about how he should actually have a good defense and other things like that. But I mean, the guy really was a spy. He was as guilty as sin. But he still, the main character played by Tom Hanks actually defended him well. He didn't win, but he defended him well. And it's the same kind of thing that I feel like I'm doing here. I'm like, this guy just did everything wrong, absolutely wrong. But for some reason, I can just completely see it from his point of view. I can see that he's just some regular guy, not some military general, not familiar with the people, focused on what tasks he was good at. But because of that, it completely lost the focus of what the mission should have been on and keeping it manned. And his just bad leadership decisions, because he was a normal guy, not a leader. He didn't have the vision and foresight to see all this happening. And so tragedy struck, and his later decisions after that compounded it exponentially. That the men who did survive were heading home with the tail tucked between their legs, needing the help of the brother of Quetzalcoatl to actually retrieve any cattle for them, and then making absolute blunders on who to send on what trail and keeping people together, and followed by which just sending panic dispatches. It was awful. Yet, I've come around to it, but it just sometimes seems so harsh when you just recognize him as a regular person. But justice is justice, I suppose. Sorry, just have that mercy, that streak of mercy that I still want to extend to him. Even though justly, what's more to be said? The facts speak for themselves. I think some stuff, unless there's more to back it up, seems like reading between the lines. And they probably are very good guesses, but it's still reading between the lines. We don't know the conversations they had. We don't know if their families said, no, please don't go back up on that mountain, or we're worried about your finger that you lost getting infected more, or something else. We don't know the conversations that they had, because those aren't recorded. And so the author's conjecture on, the shamefulness that the men of the party didn't go back for him. Yeah, I get it. It was shameful in the first place that they had left him. But at the same time, what was presented was that they were sorry for McEwen being on the mountain instead of being killed by the the ornery band of Utes in the Moab Valley, in the Elk Mountain Valley, because, here he was so close to home and then lost. I don't know if that quite speaks to them talking ill of Alfred Billings. It may suggest that, if you read it in a certain way, absolutely. But the men may also understand of, no, you guys just got back, and how about you take a rest? And I don't know. I think he just needed to back up that position more. Of course, I'm no historical author. What authoring I have tried to do, I can understand. There's just so much information you're trying to get down on the page. There's sometimes where you're like, this is sufficient. You think it's sufficient. And then someone comes back and says, well, time out here. Wait, you make this assertion, back it up with information. And so, I can't fault the author for that. It's the polished sheen to this book is a lot better than anything I've done. And the fact that he got it down and complete is a monumental feat as well. So I'm not going to fault the author too badly. And I just would have liked some of the accusations bolstered. Things to learn from the book. Well, obviously you can see divine providence in several stories in this, especially when things were starting to go awry. Starting with the 4 men who went out hunting, and 2 of them being prompted to go back, and following that prompting. Unfortunately, the other 2 men did end up being killed. God probably helping to intervene in their final struggle in the fight to allow them to leave, and the fact that the Quetzalcoatl's brother being willing to help them on their way back. Then in the blunder of sending people in the wrong type of people in the wrong direction, getting them lost in the Uintas Basin and abandoning McEwen on the mountain, you can see they had dreams to guide them, dreams and divine providence to guide them and help them return. God is mindful of us. He really is. I would absolutely say that if you ever are in one of these desperate situations, rely on the Lord. But I think most of our lives we're not in these desperate situations. So, what does this mean? It means to open your eyes more widely whenever you're a leader in a situation. And be aware, be a better expert than the other men that are around. Make good and rational decisions. There are reasons that you have specific rules of don't leave a man behind, stick together as a group, have the slowest person be the leader, so that way you don't leave each other. Stuff that you learn in the Boy Scouts. That if you are splitting up on a trail, that if you are in the lead on the trail, you stop whenever the trail becomes ambiguous or the trail splits. You just stop, so that way the people can come up next to you so they don't get lost by going down a wrong fork or lose the trail themselves. There's just a lot of things that you learn by experience, and I don't know if Alfred Billings had any of that experience. It's a good question of, well, how was he called to be a mission president? It could very well be that his calling came because of his devout religious personality, that his ability to get along with people and spiritually bolster them may have been what he was chosen for. We don't know. We just don't. On the other hand, I think it's important that if you are in leadership, trying to pick leaders to lead others, this is a whole different angle, and it's vastly different. Even if you have all the skills, it doesn't mean the people you pick have all the skills. And instead you have to be aware of what leadership looks like and how to identify it and who would have the skills. And that's a lot harder, because it's just like a job interview. You don't actually know the full skill set and personality of the person that is presented to you in an interview. You don't. In many ways, people who are in HR or who are hiring or who are managers are just rolling the dice and only picking up people who might come across well. It doesn't mean just because they come across well in the interview doesn't mean that they actually have the skills, and it doesn't mean that they actually have the abilities. It just means that they are good enough to seemingly be a good fit until you try them out. So, good luck on that one. I still do not have a good answer for that. There is apparently, hi kitty, an answer in doing a psychological test on the big 5 attributes. This I get from little pockets on the internet. Stuff like when Jordan Peterson was very strong, because, well, now he has tons of health problems, but when he was strong on the internet, he talked about different psychological tests you could do. And the big 5 were one that could actually help you figure out the dispositions of people and certain abilities. And then other studies show that you could pick leaders from that. But the problem was that you'd get pretty uniform results because you're finding people who are generally have the traits that make them successful, etc. So, it could easily be perceived as bias and other things like that, which, well, it's true. You are biased towards what the data tells you. So could you do something like that? Well, yeah, but they didn't have that then. And so in some ways it is by luck, chance, and inspiration, or a mixture of all of them. Sometimes you just need positions to be filled, and they get filled, and the Lord works with the people anyway, whether it was by his inspiration or not. And sometimes it's, for better or worse, something that needs to happen because of the choices of people. So that's a whole different theological discussion. Overall, the biggest thing that you can do is be an expert in as many facets and possibilities that you can get by going out there, gaining experience. Give yourself experiences and make mistakes. Not to encourage that mistakes are great, but make mistakes so you can learn from them. And make them small and make them often so that you can learn from them in greater amounts. Because like the greatest amount of education you can get from the least amount of blunder is the best way to go on everything in life. And life doesn't often afford us that opportunity all the time. But in a modern age that we have today, we have a lot better chances of always having smaller mistakes instead of large ones, and recognize where those mistakes are being made and correct, constantly be correcting. So that way you're ready for whatever comes next, because maybe it is bigger, maybe it is, larger consequences compared to the ability to learn from it. And so this is the time to prove your mettle and hopefully have that series of experiences that then make you successful. Again, I need to finish the real George Washington, but it seems like his military career was fraught with defeats, but one where he learned from it each time until he became successful at the most important parts of his life, and when it counted the most. So that's what I think you can absolutely learn from this book. I think also that if you start to abstract it more, you can apply it more to your modern day life with, again, if you are working among a completely different cultured person or people and how they operate. Be aware of how they operate and how things can come across. It'll have to make you, unfortunately, hyper aware and hyper attuned because you have to sit there and think, okay, are they going to take what I'm saying as bad? Is this going to continue to tank the relationship? That kind of thing. And you'll have to endure a lot of hardship and heartache until you find another way or another way out. There's kind of a bunch of different things you can learn from it. Overall, I think it's a fascinating story. I think it's something to reflect on what actually happened to the Utes in the Elk Mountain Valley, which then became Moab. you could say that the smallpox epidemic through that area may have been, divine retribution, that they had, but I don't know. It's just a thing. It depends on your point of view. You could sit there and say, "Oh, it was divine retribution," or you could say that it was just one of those things, or you could be cynical and say, "Ha, those people who think it's divine retribution are stupid." All you want. It's what I did not know that that's what cleared it out. I didn't know it was basically abandoned to Native Americans until the 1870s and 80s. But it really got its upswing, obviously, during the uranium boom. In fact, there's still uranium mines up in the mountains that they want to expand to this day. They're not in the Moab Valley itself, but in the surrounding kind of area. So, well, I hope it's been educational, if anything. Just understanding a little more of the history of what went on and how. And, I hope that it shows you when the chips are down, God is with you. And may His Spirit continue to be with you always. We'll see you.